Good morning, everyone. Continuing our series of Latin American civilization, or the history of Latin America. I'm going to today talk about the period of time called Neocolonialism from 1880 through about 1930. And that's a unique period in Latin American history. So I will just jump into it. Here it shows a little timeline. We've already talked about colonialism, post-colonialism. Now we're talking about neocolonialism. So you see 1880 was the great export boom that began. And you see 1898, the United States intervened in Cuba. A famous essay was published in 1900 called Ariel by Ruben. Nicaraguan intervention began in 1912. 1922, you had the Pan American Conference of Women. And 1929, of course, the great stock market crash, which changed a lot of things around the world. And so let me put this on the slideshow from the beginning. And so here's a picture from the book of Uncle Sam trying to teach a group of unruly students how to behave in democracy. You can see that it's obviously a little bit contemptuous and say racist as well. The superior attitude of Uncle Sam's democracy and all these people who are unready for not civilized. So we just finished the period of liberal progress, the belief that by reducing taxes and opening up free markets and limiting constitutional republics and emphasizing individuality and individual rights, that everything would get better and better. It's the myth of liberal progress, but it turned out a little bit differently in Latin America. Major Latin American cities became modern metropolises, comparable to urban giants anywhere. Streetcars swayed, telephones jangled, silent movies flickered from Montevideo to Santiago to Mexico City and Havana. So these are some similarities with modernity in the United States. Railroads multiplied miraculously, as it exported tons of sugar, coffee, copper, grain, nitrate, tin, cacao, rubber, beef, wool, and tobacco. You see, these are all raw materials, primary products. Modern port facilities replaced the spectacularly inaccurate port facilities of Buenos Aires and other locations. So this period from 1880 to 1930 we call neocolonialism. That means new colonialism, a new period of colonialism that replaced the old period with certain new dynamics. The old period of colonialism was under the tutelage of Spain and Portugal, were the colonial masters of Latin America. And in neocolonialism, Spain and Portugal were replaced by Britain and France initially, and then later the United States. So progress brought a new brand of imperialism from Great Britain and the United States. The same countries that modeled progress for Latin America helped to install it there, and sometimes owned it outright. Foreign influence was so pervasive and so powerful that Latin American historians call these years from 1880 to 1930 their neo-colonial period. Again, because the foreign influence was so pervasive and powerful, although it was oftentimes more indirect, using the influence of culture and money, investments, capital. Here is a picture of African colonialism. You see some people, some British people, presumably British, on a safari, on a hunt. This is a colonialized world. Europeans began to colonialize Africa, India, Asia. But interestingly, Latin America has the distinction of being the first colonial area. American neocolonialism was a variant of global colonialism. While outsiders dominated Latin America only informally, they turned enormous profit parts of Asia and Africa into outright formal colonies. So some things didn't change. Despite these transformations that I mentioned earlier, Latin America's subordinate relationship to European countries was one thing that didn't change, nor its basic social hierarchy created by colonization. So you still had white people at the top, even though they were born in the Americas instead of born in Europe. Those at the top derived decisive prestige and advantage from their outside connections. Instead of depending on peninsular Spaniards and Portuguese at the top, now it was English businessmen with airs of superiority and money to lend or invest in banks, railroads, or port facilities. There was a great export boom during this period, which led to a lot of immediate prosperity in Latin America. Elite and middle-class Latin Americans gained from profit from the great export boom. Let me show a picture of that. So here is a picture of the exports in Latin America. You see rubber in the Amazon area. You see bananas in Central America. So there's a number of different items. Cattle were exported from northern Mexico and Argentina. Sugar, guano, rubber, henequen, cotton, tobacco. These were all export products that Latin America was able to provide to the rest of the world, to the developed world, primarily Great Britain. So this great export boom lasted over half a century. It created rapid economic growth. It never was equaled in Latin America before or since. It was a unique period of time. For example, Mexican exports, which still included silver, along with sugar, coffee, and fibers, doubled and then doubled again in the late 1800s. The total value of Mexican trade grew by 900% between 1877 and 1910. 900%. That's a lot of growth. In Brazil, coffee was the primary export. 2/3 of the coffee drunk in the entire world came from Brazil. Coffee now utterly dominated Brazilian exports, whereas in the earlier period it had been sugar. Cuban sugar production reached an astounding 5 million tons by 1929. Chilean mining production included nitrates, copper, iron, hundreds of millions of dollars worth by 1929. In Argentina, 21 tons of wheat was exported in 1876. 21 tons of wheat. And over 1,000 times that much by 1900. The country's exports continued to grow into the 1920s. There was one point in the history, and I don't remember the date, that Argentina was the 7th wealthiest country in the world and was wealthier than the United States. Of course, that didn't last. Also in the smaller countries of Latin America, they had their own versions of the great export boom. That included Guatemala exporting coffee. Honduras exported bananas, hence the name Banana Republic. Ecuador exported cacao. and Bolivia exported tin. The quantity of railroad tracks in the region integral to the boom because the railroads were built primarily to carry exports went from 2,000 miles to 59,000 miles between 1870 and 1900. That's from 2 to 59. Class system also didn't change very much. The direct beneficiaries of this export bonanza were the large landowners whose property values soared with the approach of the railroad tracks. Beneficiaries, too, were the middle-class city dwellers, professionals, merchants, office workers, who performed the secondary functions in the import-export economy. These people, progress opened cultural horizons and brought material enrichment. The middle class grew rapidly between 1880 and 1930, but even Argentina's middle class, which was perhaps the largest in the region, represented only a quarter to a third of the population. In other words, even in a couple of countries where the middle class was growing, it was a very small percentage of the population. The great majority of the population were still living in poverty, not even working in industrial jobs. At this time period, around 1900, Latin America's total population was 14 million. No, that's not right. That's Mexico's population. I'm sorry. Mexico's smaller middle class was more typical of Latin America. Around 1900, a million or so middle-class Mexicans, were clerking in offices, riding bicycles, and listening to U.S. ragtime music. That's 1 million Mexicans out of a total Mexican population of 14 million. So that's 1/14 of the population. We're emerging into the middle class. Not a very small percentage. So the small working class, about a third of a million of cooks, laundresses, shoemakers, policemen, and so on, made up the rest of the urban population. So you have about a million emerging middle class, about a third of a million working class. That leaves, out of a population of 14 million, that leaves over 10 million people living in subsistence poverty in the rural areas. Meanwhile, 8 million country people, mostly of indigenous heritage, lucky to have a single change of clothes, sweated on the sun-drenched land to produce Mexico's agricultural products. Thanks to progress, their lot was actually getting worse. So this was the problem with this modernization period, was that you had a few people benefiting and a lot of people who were losing out. Also in the Andes, the indigenous peoples of the Andes lost their village lands in the neocolonial period. In general, the landless country people of Latin America, who for centuries had grown their own food and supplied their own needs as subsistence farmers, now had nowhere to plant their potatoes, manioc, corn, or beans. As export profits beckoned, the owners of haciendas and plantations acquired more and more land. Here's These are a picture of some Bolivian peasants, and there's a picture of semi-sedentary people in the fringes of colonization, such as the Mapuches of Chile, who lost ground to the advance of commercial agriculture at the turn of the century. So subsistence agriculture is when you grow your own food. Commercial agriculture is when you grow large amounts of corn or soybeans or wheat in order to export it. Latin American exports during this time. Coffee boomed in the tropics, creating several kinds of neocolonial landscapes. Colombia was another big producer of coffee, and in Colombia, it did help produce a prosperous rural middle class. It could be produced on plantations or small family farms. Sugar production and mining, in contrast, were always massive industrialized operations that divided societies ruthlessly into rich and poor. That's because sugar production required massive amounts of manpower, cheap manpower, which basically equaled slavery. Because of high capital requirements, installations such as refineries for Cuban sugar, oil wells pumping Mexican and Venezuelan crude oil, and deep shaft mines in the high Andes were usually foreign-owned. In Peru, the massive state-of-the-art mining complex at the U.S. Cerro de Pasco Copper Corporation was one example. Neocolonialism also brought a rubber boom. The latex sap of the rubber tree was a raw material consumed especially in the United States for automobile tires. Rubber harvesters lived isolated along the riverbanks deep in the Amazon basin, tapping sap from rubber trees. In the Colombian, Ecuadorian, and Peruvian areas of the Amazon basin, many were semi-sedentary indigenous people terrorized into wage labor they neither needed or wanted. Picture to illustrate that, you see here the rubber area, the waters of the Amazon. And let's talk about bananas. The banana nightmare. Bananas were a neo-colonial nightmare. The U.S. banana companies blossomed in the 1880s and 1890s, becoming a multinational corporations, among the first anywhere in the world. By the early 1900s, several of them emerged into one company called the United Fruit Company, a banana empire operating in Costa Rica, Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Panama, Colombia, and Venezuela. United Fruit Company made several Central American nations into banana republics, where it could keep governors, cabinet ministers, even presidents in its deep corporate pockets. The banana companies acquired millions of acres for their plantations, millions more for future use, and millions more simply to head off possible competition. And actually, I wanted to mention that in one of my favorite books, the Nobel Prize-winning 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, there's a section of the book, most of the book overlaps with the neocolonial period, even though it's supposed to be 100 years. But the middle part of the book is the neocolonial period of Latin America. And there's one particular episode around page 243 where a gringo, an American businessman named Mr. Herbert, shows up in Machado hunting butterflies. And he's invited in to enjoy the hospitality of the Buendia family. And while he's in their home, he eats a banana. After the fruit company shows up and takes over the town to produce bananas, totally changing the social landscape of that area of Colombia, Colonel Aureliano Buendia says on page 246, "Look at the mess we've gotten ourselves into." Colonel Aureliano Buendia said at that time, just because we invited a gringo to eat some bananas. So that's 100 Years of Solitude. And then it later goes on to document the massacre that took place in the coast of Colombia. No one knows actually how many people died in that massacre. Here's a picture of a street in Buenos Aires around 1900. You see a horse-drawn buggy as well as cars there. Actually, it might be a little bit after 1900. since they're self-driving. There's automobiles. And this brings us to Machado Giassis. Let's see if I can get this is a picture of Machado Giassis on the left and Ruben Dario on the right. In 1897, Machado de Giassis became the president of the Brazilian Academy of Letters, where he presided over a distinguished crowd of poets, statesmen, and scholars. Ruben Dario, a dark mestizo, child prodigy from a small town in Nicaragua, received an international tribute for his literary genius. Dario became one of the most influential poets ever to write in the Spanish language. And I think this is the Mexico's Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe, La Virgen de Guadalupe, Mexico, which basically celebrates the idea of a mestizo Madonna, and became sort of a bridge for Mexico's mestizos and indigenous peoples to become Catholic and to transition from their indigenous religions over to Catholicism, with the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe, La Virgen de Guadalupe. This is built over the shrine to the Aztec goddess Tonitzin, the filth eater, or the mother goddess in the Aztec of gods and goddesses. Okay, so we've gone 21 minutes. I'm going to stop here and continue this. This is a little bit too much material for one video, so I will continue it in part 2. Thank you very much. See you soon.